Okay, finally, Chapter 10, the last chapter of 10 Days That Unexpectedly Changed America. This chapter's title is Freedom Summer. Quick overview, then the details of the chapter. The campaign to register blacks throughout the South in 1964 was known as Freedom Summer. The program attracted a number of college students, both black and white, to the South, including Michael Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, and James Earl Chaney, who actually traveled to Mississippi, of course. Their presence was viewed by the whites of Mississippi and the South like an invasion of a foreign army. On June 21st, 1964, which happened to be Father's Day, one of the organizers, Robert Moses, predicted, like Robert Moses had predicted, it would take a tragedy to call attention to the plight of blacks in the South. That was his prediction. They will bring the rest of the country with them, he said. The painful reality was that the press and the public cared only when a white person was killed. These three men, these reluctant martyrs of Freedom Summer, and the odd coincidence of an 1989 movie permanently changed race relations in the South, is what the author said about this. The flow of the chapter itself began by tracing the steps of the early civil rights movement up to 1964. It gave emphasis to the fact that blacks in the South could not vote because of the use of the poll tax. You had to pay money to vote, and the use of a literacy test. So different organizations were being formed across the country to fight against and to protest that. It mentioned SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, were formed to fight this. Freedom riders, white students, and black students from the North began to travel to the South to try to register to get blacks to vote. The book mentions that it appeared as if Mississippi and most of the South was frozen in time in regard to their views of racial integration. Perhaps slightly harsh on Mississippi, but it is hard to ignore the details of what happened here. The rate of poverty in the South for blacks, of course, was very high, and violence against them was extremely high when they tried to resist the white power structure and to gain the right to vote. Robert Moses was a leading organizer of the early civil rights organization in the North, and he called for white students to travel to the South. Moses is the one that believed that if whites got involved, it would actually bring national attention. Then the chapter begins to detail a meeting that took place in Ohio as civil rights workers were trained, or freedom riders were trained to come to the South. It introduces us to an Andrew Goodman, who was a wealthy northerner, white student who volunteered, and it talks about his discussion and training that took place when he traveled to Ohio to make his visit to the South. Goodman met while receiving his training to head to the South. He met a Michael Schwerner, who was a Jewish student from Manhattan who had experience as a community organizer. He had actually moved, he and his wife, to Meridian and had set up a community center, and they had been involved in the fight already. James Earl Chaney was the black man of the three, and he too had worked in Meridian with the Schwerners. And it gives the detail of them meeting and their friendship as they were bonded together. The three traveled to Neshoba County to investigate a black church burning. The Klan of Mississippi was alarmed at these freedom riders during Freedom Summer that planned to come to Mississippi, and they planned acts of violence. Particularly, the Jewish student Schwerner was already a marked man. On June 21st, which was Father's Day, the three traveled to Neshoba County and investigated a church that had been burned to the ground. They stayed there, investigated, interviewed some people, left early enough that they believed they could get back to Philadelphia before dark. But while traveling back, they were stopped by a Philadelphia deputy sheriff by the name of Cecil Price, who took them to jail. While being held in jail, the Klan and its leader, Edgar Ray Killen, was contacted, and under Killen's plan and the Klan meeting, they planned for an ambush of these three. When they were released at 10:30, they were captured. It gives the brutal details of that. They were killed and buried in an earthen dam on a farm nearby. The response to this, since two whites were killed, was a little bit more dramatic than it had been with just acts of violence in the South against blacks. It mentioned that initially 140 FBI agents were sent in to investigate. That number would swell as the investigation continued. It took a while to find the bodies because they were misled by the station wagon where the men had been thrown into, was found burned at a different location. They dredged a swamp, etc. The federal government, again up to this point, had ignored acts of violence against blacks, but now with two whites, it gains a lot of national attention. Which, strangely enough, kind of outraged, or not strange, actually, it outraged many of those involved in the civil rights movement that were African Americans. Why now only are we getting attention? It's just because whites have been killed. There have been blacks that have been killed and have been missing for a very long time. Eventually, what happened is that this event will lead to a change in the civil rights movement, as whites are going to be somewhat stiff-armed, as blacks are going to want to take more of the leadership positions in the civil rights movement, and they began to call for changes. A Voting Rights Act, for example, which would give blacks in the South the right to vote. Goes through some of the politics of that. President Johnson delayed any sort of vote on a Voting Rights Act until after his re-election in '64. As this investigation of where the dead bodies are actually located was taking place, the Mississippi establishment led by Senator James O. Eastland denied the event, denied the murder, said that it was a communist plot, a northern plot, etc. The bodies were finally found after an informant tipped them off. The bodies were found on August the 4th, and so there you have it in terms of the bodies finally being discovered. That same summer, which was an election year, black Democrats tried to get seated as delegates at the Democratic National Convention being held in Atlantic City, New Jersey. They were denied. Their leader was a lady by the name of Fannie Lou Hamer, a sharecropper from Mississippi. So they were denied that, which again angered them. And again, one of the results of this case is that whites are going to be kind of pushed out to a certain extent from the civil rights movement. So white activists are going to turn their attention to Vietnam anti-war protest. The Vietnam War was escalating at this time, so they shifted gears. That summer, again, focused the nation on the problems of racial tension in the South. It did lead to changes. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed, allowing blacks much more ease in registering and being able to vote, and just having their civil rights protected. A Voting Rights Act of '65 was passed, and the FBI and its leader, J. Edgar Hoover, infiltrated the Klan that had existed in the South, and it was eventually brought down. Some of the men that were involved in this murder were brought to trial. 7 were convicted, but none of them were given a sentence for more than 6 years, so kind of mediocre justice, but yet it was the first time that any whites had been convicted for the killing of a black man. As time passed, more of these people that that had been involved in violence against blacks were brought to justice. It mentioned a Jerry Mitchell, who was a Christian newspaper writer and activist who began to be concerned that justice had not been done and ended up investigating acts of violence against blacks, and different whites who had been involved in these acts of violence were finally brought to trial. It mentioned the importance of the 1989 movie Mississippi Burning, which brought national attention to it. So in the 1990s, additional white people that had been involved in violence were brought to trial and found guilty. And most recently, in 2005, Edgar Ray Killen, who was instrumental and the leader in the deaths of Schwerny, Cheney, and Goodman back in '64. He was found guilty of 3 counts of murder. Even though he was an elderly man, he was still sentenced for that. So justice ended up being done in the end. It just took time. That completes chapter 10 and thus the book.